Hey all you cats and kittens and all you non-binary fittins, it's your boy DBiddles. Welcome to Chatbots. Alright, so listen up. I've got this here model kit. It's from an anime what's got robots in it. Anime with robots in them is kind of my thing. Anyways, I've got this here robot. It needs putting together, and while I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the anime where it's from, and then that's going to lead into me talking about something else pretty strongly related to that anime talk, right? So I chat and I build robots, hence the name Chatbots. You get it, pretty straightforward. Don't know what else you'd expect from a name like that. I don't know, maybe you expected some kind of robot that algorithmically generates chat from user input prompts and some kind of weird artificial learning software that sources data from the internet to respond to those prompts? Yeah, get real there, Johnny 5. Bit of a stretch, don't you think? Hey, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the like button if you understood that short circuit reference. Hell, you know what? Do that anyways. Hit like even if B-tier 80s sci-fi films are not permanently taking up space in your head, alright? Anyways, previously on General Hospital, we built the Gurren Satan from Code Geass, Lelouch of the Rebellion, and we use that to discuss the ways that political violence manifests itself in subtle ways and how important it is to pay attention to all this dry political stuff on account of how it really is way more dire than all the dreary and boring talk of budgets and elections and fiscal policy would have you think. And keen-eyed viewers will note that this robot I have today, the Lancelot Albion, is also from Code Geass. And if you're new here, you know that I don't normally do that. Typically I jump around to all kinds of different robot series. I've done a couple Gundams, but I usually space those episodes out, and like, come on, it's Gundam. There's a bunch of those Gundam shows. But truth be told, there's still a lot of meat on the Geass bone, and you know, I might have another thematically appropriate topic to go along with this other kit I'd like to build. So let's take another look. I'm assuming you watched my previous episode, or else you know what Code Geass is about, but in case you haven't seen Geass or my previous episode, here's a quick recap. In an alternate history to our own, where America renames itself the Holy Britannian Empire, Japan is invaded and conquered by Britannia and their army of mechs, the Nightmare Frames. Lelouch v. Britannia, the estranged son of Emperor Charles v. Britannia, is living in exile in Japan, now known as Area 11, when he gets caught up in an attack by Japanese freedom fighters striking a Britannian military supply line. This incident brings him into contact with C2, a mysterious woman who grants him the power of Geass, which allows him to mind control a person into obeying his exact orders, a power which only works once on everyone he uses it on. With this power, he assumes the identity of Zero, a master revolutionary, and he sets out to destroy Britannia, liberate Japan, and kill his dad, because he's pretty sure his dad killed his mom. With the help of C2 and his Black Knights, will Lelouch of the Rebellion succeed in halting Britannia's global campaign of conquest? I mean, probably. That's usually how these things go. The good guys win, right? Yeah. Anyways, that brings us back to our robot here. The Lancelot, and later the Lancelot Albion, are piloted in service of Britannia by Suzaku Kururugi, whom I mentioned last episode was a full-blooded Japanese citizen. Suzaku is actually a childhood friend of Lelouch and the son of Genbu Kururugi, who was Japan's prime minister at the time of Britannia's invasion. Suzaku is a kind person, but he's a little mixed up. He has a strong sense of justice and often throws himself in harm's way to protect people, but he brings a sort of the ends don't justify the means reformist vibe that Lelouch and the other 11s don't like very much. In an attempt to bring an early and peaceful end to the initial conflict between Japan and Britannia, old Suzu decides that maybe if he assassinates his Da, who presumably didn't take kindly to Britannia rocking up on Japan's shores, that maybe they can all play nice and get along. Yeah, Suzaku's a moron like that. As you might imagine, Japan obliging these invaders by murdering their own head of state, something Britannia probably already had on their invasion checklist, does not actually make them take it easy on Japan. Can't fathom why. Japan folds pretty quickly after the assassination, as you might have guessed. So, arguably, at least from Suzaku's point of view, this act of patricide saved a bunch of lives that might have been lost in long, drawn-out battles. Maybe. Kinda like how some people like to say that America dropping nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki actually saved more lives than the between 1 and 200,000 some people who were killed by those strikes? Seems a little unlikely, but do go off on how you're such a big hero, President Truman. Either way, we can't see that timeline. Maybe so much of the death and destruction and suffering that follows in Code Geass would have been prevented by the war. Maybe so much of that is directly Suzaku's fault. Maybe in trying so hard to not let good ends be justified by bad means, you actually just created a different set of bad means that result in bad ends. Maybe capitulating to ruthless authoritarianism in order to find some sort of fabled middle ground is actually a short-sighted and cowardly solution. It's impossible to say for sure, but we get ahead of ourselves. Suzaku goes out of his way to rescue a Britannian soldier from the Black Knights, Lelouch's team of revolutionary vigilantes and saboteurs, and for this, the Britannians beat his ass. But after that, they decide that maybe a crazy dork like him who's committed to the cause of peaceful resolutions would be an ideal peacekeeping officer. So they put him in a nightmare frame and have him help with quelling unlawful protests. So naturally, every time the Black Knights start fucking up Britannia's shit, out comes the Lancelot to try and arrest them. Though, since Britannia is the ruling authority in Area 11, they could make any fucking laws and declare those in violation of them to be dangerous criminals who are going to extreme measures to protest the law. Hey, new Britannian law, everyone. 11s aren't allowed to wear shoes because they keep throwing them at Britannian soldiers. Any 11 caught wearing shoes will be considered dangerous and will be dealt with appropriately. That doesn't happen, but you get it. When you make the rules, no matter how stupid or bad those rules are, anyone who defies you is immediately considered dangerous. And when you have control, you don't have to listen to appeals to humanity, morality, or civility. If you cared about being humane or being just, you wouldn't be a despotic regime. It might be why last episode's model was called the Gurren Satan. Gurren actually translates to something like red or crimson or scarlet. Still not sure what Lagan translates to, sorry. Anyways, Japan is sometimes referred to as the Land of the Rising Sun, and that's actually what their flag is meant to represent, a crimson sun in a sky of white. So it's wholly appropriate that the Gurren, being the Black Knight's flagship mech, bear that color. It's a symbol of pride and defiance and Japanese patriotism in the face of colonization. And while it's spelled differently, the use of the moniker Satan, the adversary, the accuser, is also appropriate. Christian missionaries have been something of a recurring nuisance in Japan's history, and while non-religious Christian culture has been integrated into Japanese society, such as in wedding ceremonies or celebrating a secular version of Christmas, it's generally considered a colonizer's religion. The Christian sect known as the Quakers, in particular, have had a strong influence on Japanese culture, and Emperor Hirohito actually hired an American Quaker by name of Elizabeth Janet Gray to tutor his son. Many credit Quakerism with Japanese sentiments of pacifism. So, adopting this antithetical figure as a symbol for a resistance of an invading Western power is thematically appropriate. But again, any resistance to the ruling authority, no matter how unjust that ruling authority is, will be painted as villainy. So it only makes sense why rebellious forces will often identify with those symbols of villainy. Counterculture movements embrace that villain narrative because they see the injustice of the establishment and decide that they're okay with being reviled by those who support it. It's why the punk movement or gangstas call themselves those names. It's why Lil Nas X and Sam Smith and AC/DC and Kiss dressed up as the devil for their performances. It's why you hear the slogan, "Be gay, do crimes." It's why NWA's most famous song is "Fuck the Police." Hell, most people who identify as Satanists are just atheists who think that Christianity really sucks ass. They're trying to be subversive. You might consider it juvenile, but when laws are unjust, when injustice is framed as good by virtue of being legal, breaking the law becomes the moral good. Meanwhile, maintaining the cruelty of the status quo gets framed as the noble thing to do. Hence why most of the other nightmare frames get named after heroes of Arthurian lore. I'll confess to not being as super knowledgeable about the canon of Arthurian legends as I'd like to be, but I can say that Lancelot was considered the most powerful and righteous of Camelot's knights of the round, hence why he's the most well-known of said knights after Arthur. And just like Lancelot, Suzaku has his own Guinevere, namely Euphemia v Britannia, one of the many heirs to the Britannian throne and another of Lelouch's sisters. She, like Suzaku, believes there's a peaceful legal diplomatic solution to the hostilities, but it's unclear whether or not her vision would involve Britannia vacating Japan. Eufy's extremely popular among the citizenry, Britannian and Eleven alike, and she curries great favor with her father, the Emperor, not just because she's pretty and graceful, but because she's outspoken in advocating for the rights of the Elevens and is appalled at how the occupation is harming them. Her kind words and impassioned speeches capture the attention and respect of friend and foe alike. Even the cartoonishly bigoted Nina Einstein of Ashford Academy Student Council has a deep admiration for Euphemia. I won't spoil because it's hilarious, but Nina gets a scene that really illustrates her appreciation for the princess. Euphemia's civil rights crusade on behalf of the Elevens seems like it'll be the silver bullet for the conflict, but, well, then the story will end too quickly and too neatly, and we can't have that now, can we? Again, I don't want to spoil, but this plot point tends to be pretty controversial for how it's resolved. I personally don't think it's that bad. It's hinted as a possibility well in advance of the twist, and I think it's sudden and surprising enough to be dramatically interesting. But there were probably better ways of answering the Euphemia question and having the plot continue. But either way, the point remains. The Elevens cannot rely on the benevolence of the system that oppresses them. Their liberation will not be gifted to them if they are patient and obedient. They must fight back. They must rebel. They must revolt. They must seize the freedom that is rightfully theirs. It's a lesson that Suzaku needs to learn the hard way, but learn it he eventually does. His attempts at peaceful resolutions where peace is not even considered by the forces he works for will only lead to more harm, more hurt, more destruction. And secretly, he hopes it will. He's hoping his efforts will get him killed because he's secretly wanting to be punished for the murder of his father. Maybe he's hoping that his symbolic death will succeed where the symbolic murder of his father failed. Ironic, given that Lelouch, his friend and rival, is on a quest to kill his own father, and succeeding there will most definitely resolve a lot of the conflict. Lelouch and Suzaku actually make really fascinating foils for each other, even though it's completely obvious which one the series wants us to root for and sympathize with, what with his name being in the title and all. For example, Suzaku dashes headfirst into every situation, is the first one on the battlefield, and yet he's a pacifist. Lelouch, meanwhile, is cautious and calculated and prefers to delegate, but he's not afraid to get his hands, his reputation, his own soul completely dirty. Where Suzaku killed his father and is now seeking to punish himself in order to atone, Lelouch swears vengeance on his father and gets involved where he need not have in order to achieve that. Suzaku's most directly negatively affected by this struggle, and yet he aids the side he should be fighting, whilst Lelouch most directly benefits from the circumstances and would be well served to leave things be, but he strikes at the power that privileges him. Suzaku is sincerely altruistic and wants to help people, but he's usually just helping to prop up the systems that oppress him. Meanwhile, Lelouch is motivated by a personal vendetta, and while he initially sees his erstwhile allies as mere pawns to achieve that goal, he often sees situations more clearly and actually is working to meaningfully address the problems. While Suzaku puts himself in the spotlight, tries very hard to be a champion and a martyr for a cause he believes in, however misguided he may be, Lelouch is actually the one who achieves the status of revolutionary figure despite skulking in the shadows, hiding behind a mask, creating a symbol, Zero, rather than permitting himself to be a demagogue. And indeed, a symbol is what Zero ends up being. I could go on, but I'd rather you just check it out if you haven't yet. I will say, though, that Lelouch and Suzaku end up learning from each other indirectly about how to be true revolutionaries for the Japanese liberation cause by story's end. Suzaku learns that his pacifism is actually the far more ignoble method, and Lelouch learns true selflessness, finally taking up the cause of liberation in earnest. But again, no spoilers. However, something I absolutely do want to spoil is the mood. Now hey, listen. All of what you're about to hear is satire, or a joke, or me just throwing out ideas that I absolutely do not intend for you to take seriously. I would never advocate for you to do anything illegal or dangerous or violent. That would be wrong. If you get that impression from anything I say, then I disavow. Do not try to read between the lines. There is no forest here, just a bunch of trees. Alright, disclaimer over. So hey, big election coming up. The Cheeto Chungus versus Sleepy Brandon, round 2. This time it's personal. Oh, let me tell you, I started typing this up months in advance of recording it, and Jesus fuck-mothering shit bastard piss Christ, I have had to go back and rewrite and amend it more than a few times, and might have to open her up and hit her again a few more times before I finally get around to posting it. But I'm pretty satisfied with it right now, he said to himself on July 12th, 2024. And then again on July 20th, 2024. Okay, so, despite the January 6th insurrection attempt, despite illegally keeping sensitive classified documents, despite 34 felony charges, despite having defamed a woman he raped, despite a porn star scandal, despite basically quoting Mein Kampf at his rallies, despite unsealed Epstein documents that implicate him as being John Doe 174, a client of history's king of pedophilia, and despite almost being shot, there's still a pretty good chance that Teflon Don could be president again. And for the record, it really doesn't matter who is actually behind the assassination attempt, whether it was the Dems trying to avoid an electoral failure, or the Republicans trying to make their candidate look better, or if it really was just a crazy dumb kid who thought he was doing the world a favor, it actually doesn't matter. The people who are going to vote for the orange orangutan have already decided what they want the plot of their reality to be. Their daddy is a superhero trying to fix the entire world, and everyone else is either one of his sidekicks or else is aligned with the secret society of supervillains bent on turning everyone into a blood-drinking, devil-worshipping child molester. Projection much? Any piece of evidence that is contrary to that narrative is just a square peg that they will mentally pound into a round hole. Even if someone found irrefutable video evidence of some true-believing Trump staffer detailing his master plan to use Thomas Matthew Crooks to secure a Trump victory, it wouldn't matter. The Trump base has already dismissed everything else Trump does as either fake news or stuff that he should be allowed to do anyways. They want their Orange King, and nothing is going to dissuade them. Meanwhile, after weeks and weeks of Biden bumbling through embarrassing debates and public appearances, someone finally convinced the Dems that maybe this election shouldn't be a choice between two of the most useless, pudding-brained revenants on God's green earth, so that one of them could be elected to the seat of highest authority in our country, and that maybe doing so would actually be pretty damning of our entire system. Not that it seems to have stopped Mitch fucking McConnell. So instead, we get to choose between one pudding-brained revenant and a lady cop who seems like she might be okay-ish. You know, besides being a cop and all. Spoiled for choice, aren't we? So glad that our entire country can be held hostage by one party that seems determined to dig new sub-basements for the fucking Titanic when it comes to scraping the bottom of the barrel, and another one that's almost as bad, and whose sales pitch is always just an exceedingly smug, "Well, at least we're not as bad as the elephant. Do you want the elephant? No? Didn't think so. Better vote for us or it'll be all your fault that we don't do more to stop the elephant when it goes on a rampage." And despite all that, I'm still gonna make sure I do my part and pull the lever on election day. And I'm sure that just by suggesting that, some of you have probably already dismissed everything I'm about to say. "Oh, DBiddles, do you really think it'll make a difference? Do you really think a vote for Kamala Harris or Jill Stein or Bernie or any other candidate is going to improve things? You know that a vote for a lesser evil is still a vote for evil. Don't tell me you're one of those shit-lib blue MAGA types." No, viewer, I am not a blue MAGA shitlib. I assure you, I am not so blind as to think that enough lever pulls will save the day. I know that a lot of people use voting as a substitute for doing anything more meaningful, But I also know that those folks who squawk the loudest about how pointless voting is are usually just shit posters who weren't going to do anything anyways, and they just want to pretend that they're actually cooler than all the liberal electoralist sheeple. But I'm not stupid either, just because I think that it doesn't hurt to cast a ballot regardless, on the off chance that it does prevent some small bit of unpredictable harm further on down the line, just like it doesn't hurt to clip the plastic six-pack rings before I put them in the recycling so no sea turtles choke on it. I know that if Kamala wins, it's unlikely she'll do much to materially benefit us in a meaningful way. She might do some good stuff. Certainly she'll do more so than the opposition. Or she might simply do less harm than the opposition. I think that the Biden admin's been somewhat decent on labor issues and some progressive talking points, but let's not fool ourselves. Their job isn't to fix things for you and I. It's to facilitate things for the moneyed interests whom they actually serve. They're not about to make things that much better. I think it's important that we beat Donnie T, because no matter what happens, I do think he's the worst option for everyone. And I don't think he'll ever go to jail despite being so painfully, blatantly, obviously guilty of insurrection on top of a mountain of other heinous shit. And I don't think he's likely to catch one in the forehead anytime soon. But I also don't think that keeping him and his now literally diaper-wearing cult from getting back into power is going to suddenly make things chill again. Because things were never actually all that chill to begin with. Recently, and you might have heard about this, in Ohio where I live, we had an election to vote on whether or not abortion rights should be protected in our state. In that same election, the legalization of weed was also up for a vote, and both measures passed with a whopping 57%. A few months prior to that, we had a special election where we voted upon changing the threshold of voter percentage necessary to alter our state's constitution from simple majority rule of 51% to 60%, and that was shot down by, you guessed it, 57%. All of this in deep red Ohio. Sounds pretty good, right? The system works. Kind of weird how there was this consistent 57% vote for two big progressive issues, and just a few months prior to that, someone tried to set up some 60% limit that would have just barely blocked these initiatives. Boy, isn't that convenient. Funny thing about that, Ohio government had prior to all of this recently decided that special elections just weren't worth doing because not enough people turn out for them, so they were just a big waste of time and money. But somehow they tried to sneak this 60% issue through in one such special election, perhaps hoping that the low turnout would act in favor of the bill to raise our constitutional amendment threshold. And if I were a betting man, I'd imagine the 60% figure was decided upon because someone had polled our citizenry and come to the conclusion that in order to prevent our 57% of progressive citizens from successfully voting on policy, that a quick change in the rules would enable a minoritarian governance of our, again, pretty historically red state. And while I know that 57% doesn't seem like much, I mean it's only 7% over the 50% middle point, it's worth remembering that 57% in favor means that the remaining percentage, 43%, is the dissenting faction. Meaning there's actually a 14% difference there. I know, math sometimes plays tricks with your brain unless you spell it all out. 14% is nothing to sneeze at. If you have 57 people square up on 43 people for a fight, there's a pretty obvious advantage. 14 of those 43 people would have two opponents to contend with instead of just a one-on-one fight. And if all 14 of those two-on-one fights were losses for Team 43%, then 28 of the 29 remaining members of the 43% would then have three-on-one fights to contend with. And that's assuming that all of those 43 actually have strong enough convictions about it and aren't just defaulting to a normalcy bias. Maybe a few of them could be convinced of the merits of the 57, or maybe they just don't care enough that they'll concede to what is clearly a losing battle, and they'll embrace the 57. Maybe this fight would actually look like 20 or 30 of the most radically galvanized folks versus 70 or 80. So, 57% passed it, despite some underhanded tactics. What do you suppose happened then? Well, you're not gonna believe this, but I guess our state legislatures really didn't want to do the things that we voted for them to do. Why? Who knows? Doesn't matter why they didn't want to do it, they just didn't wanna. In fact, some dickhead from North Dakota, Representative Brandon Pritchard, tweeted out specifically about Ohio that, quote, direct democracy should not exist. And also, quote, it would be an act of courage to ignore the results of the election. This dude has also previously called out to conservatives to, quote, put into code that Jesus Christ is king and dedicate their state to him. So, he's basically just advocating for theocracy. He doesn't believe in constitutional democracy. He wants you to shut up and be forced to live by the rules he wants you to live by. But okay, he's an elected official who's supposed to uphold democracy in his state from some other place far away. Who cares what he has to say? Well, apparently 4 members of the Ohio legislature were on his side, namely Republican state representatives Jennifer Gross, Bill Dean, Melanie Miller, and Beth Lear, all said on August 9th, 2023, a day after the election, that they intended to push for the legislature to make decisions about these amendments, not the courts, not the voters. The statement they issue says, quote, to prevent mischief by pro-abortion courts with Issue 1, Ohio legislators will consider removing jurisdiction from the judiciary over this ambiguous ballot initiative. And that, quote, the Ohio legislature alone will consider what, if any, modifications to make to existing laws based on public hearings and input from legal experts on both sides. I'm sorry. Ambiguous? Prevent mischief? What ambiguity are these shitty little anti-choice mischief makers talking about? Ohio House Speaker Jason Stevens is among a number of Ohio Republican legislators who have vowed to fight back against this amendment. He said, quote, the legislature has multiple paths that we will explore to continue to protect innocent life. This is not the end of the conversation. Oh, and they're definitely trying to get around having to honor Issue 2 as well. Make no mistake, they want to hand-wave that victory away too. They're basically just saying, we lost, but fuck you anyways. They held 2 elections, one of which they weren't even supposed to have, and was funded by some out-of-state billionaire, Richard Whelan. They lost both of them, and now they're doing whatever the fuck they want anyways. So I'm sorry, I thought we lived in a democracy. I thought after Roe v. Wade was overturned, we were leaving this up to the states to decide. The state decided, but apparently these slimy fucking ghouls are just gonna do what they want anyways. The 43% apparently needs a fucking participation trophy because they keep getting spanked by the will of the 57% who are now just expected to eat shit. Oh, those dastardly Republicans! Too bad there aren't more Democrats in your state. Yeah, sure, for all the good that would do us. How many times have Democrats had the opportunity to do something good, campaigned on, and got elected on doing something good, and then they just fucking didn't do it? Joe Biden campaigned on ending the ICE internment of children at our southern border, campaigned on dismantling the internment facilities that Obama built and that Trump made quite liberal use of. Tell me, have those facilities been shut down? Have those migrant children been freed? Republicans like to keep scaremongering about our southern border, how there's apparently just huge convoys of fentanyl just getting brought over in great heaping truckloads, and how they're just waltzing past immigration control with a smile and a nod from a bunch of smug SJWs. But the immigration policy of the Biden administration hasn't changed at all from the Trump administration. He's just not constantly hyperfixating on building some American equivalent of the Great Wall of China. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who is playing into this whole "the hordes are at our door" narrative, has actually instructed Border Patrol to put razor wire in bodies of water along the border so anyone trying to swim across gets tangled in it and drowns or bleeds out. Which sounds like some kind of insane thing that Vlad the Impaler or Ernst Stavro Blofeld would do for their volcano doom fortresses, and not the supposed freest nation on Earth. Now, to its credit, the Biden admin ordered Governor Abbott to knock that shit off and take down the barbed wire. Wouldn't want all those poor migrant children to suffer some terrible, gruesome fate outside of our internment facilities. Governor Abbott, however, decided that no, he liked his Bond villain booby traps as they were, thank you very much, so he ignored that. Well, that made Dark Brandon very mad, make no mistake, and so he said, "Fine, Jack, you want to protect our border with draconian xenophobic policy? Well, let's just do some of that then, huh?" And he and the Dems drafted up some even more strict regulations for Mexican migrants to have to adhere to, with $20 billion in funding to go towards, and I quote from the official Whitehouse briefing, link below, an additional 1,500 armed Border Patrol agents, we already have 20,000 of them, 4,300 more asylum officers, we currently have 1,000, 10,000 more detention beds, 40,000 already in use, 100 more immigration judges, in addition to the 734 already employed, and 100 machines for inspecting for fentanyl, and God only knows how those work, probably something to do with those robot flamethrower dogs if I had my guess. Well, wouldn't you know, Governor Abbott doesn't actually care about policy, he just wants to murder brown people and be obnoxious to his political opposition for the sake of hyping up his bloodthirsty base. Abbott didn't actually want any of what the Biden admin was offering, nor did any other Republican politicians. They just wanted Biden to look stupid so people vote for Trump, and so they can finally add machine guns and piranhas to the underwater barbed wire. Well, obviously, since he's the president and he's giving commands to an insubordinate governor, Biden could just send federal troops down to Texas and arrest Governor Abbott at gunpoint for disobeying a direct command from the highest position of authority in our country, and then he could have those troops disassemble the offending barbed wire. Yeah, none of that happened. No, instead the Biden admin just shrugged its shoulders to their voter base who dislike all those inhumane authoritarian policies he just got done suggesting, that voted against such policies, and he said, "Aw shucks, well, what can I do? I tried asking nicely, I tried reaching across the aisle, but I guess they're just being jerks about it. Oh well, it's a free country. Just vote harder, guys. We need more Democrats so that stuff like this doesn't happen." He could fix it whenever he wanted to. He's the motherfucking president. He could have Abbott stripped of his position and authority. He could cut federal funding to Texas and the border until they comply. But he doesn't. He doesn't care. He's ultimately fine with it. Or how about the start of the Biden presidency when he tried to pass the giant Build Back Better infrastructure bill, and so long as all the Democrats in the Senate went along with it, it would have passed easy peasy. Oh, but somehow Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, who have financial ties to fossil fuel companies that would have been negatively impacted by the bill, and that's somehow not a major conflict of interest, decided that this infrastructure bill needed to be hacked to pieces so that none of it meaningfully impacts the fossil fuel industry. So even when you have enough Democrats, they can just jam up much-needed infrastructure spending with a few holdouts. But they can somehow pass a TikTok ban with no problem, with overwhelming support in fact, even though their concerns seem dubious at best and wildly irrational and super unpopular at worst. It's almost like there's always someone who can run interference whenever it benefits them to do so. It's almost like there's always someone who can get in the way of the process or try to compromise when there's an obvious and easily accomplishable win. It's almost like their interest isn't to the public, but to the wealthy and powerful. It's almost like when they try to find the middle ground, try to reach across the aisle. They're just making concessions to the worst people. Here in the past couple months, the Supreme Court just started wilding out, and in addition to a number of terrible decisions, decided that Trump has limited immunity in the January 6th insurrection case. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote, and I quote,
"We conclude that under our constitutional structure of separated powers, the nature of presidential power requires that a former president have some immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts during his tenure in office, at least with respect to the president's exercise of his core constitutional powers. This immunity must be absolute. The president enjoys no immunity for unofficial acts, and not everything the president does is official. The president is not above the law."
All this after a federal appeals court had told the Trump team that the notion of presidential immunity was absolutely laughable. Just listen to how vague the language is in Chief Justice Roberts' statement. No clarity as to what the limits of the immunity is, just some immunity. No clarity as to what constitutes an official act. No clarity as to where in the Constitution this opinion smelling of freshly pulled ass juice came from. Just something vague enough that he can do whatever he wants while they say, "No guys, come on, the law still applies to everybody, don't be ridiculous." Fun fact, Supreme Court justices are not elected. They're appointed by the president, and they are allowed to remain on the Supreme Court until they fucking die if they so choose. Trump, in his time, appointed 3 of the 9 current justices. So neat how these unelected high priests are just allowed to rule over us with basically no oversight. Many were quick to point out that the Biden administration, who was critical of the ruling, could then call on SEAL Team 6 to official act Donald Trump into oblivion, but the White House was quick to dismiss the idea. Of course, once again, something they'd apparently be well within their rights to do, and they're just not going to. Hey, remember when Trump said he could shoot someone in broad daylight on 5th Avenue and he wouldn't lose any voters? Well, now he can do it without legal consequence, too. But don't worry, old Joe got a consolation prize in the form of the White House being allowed to censor any particularly loud social media accounts. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the White House being allowed to contact social media companies and have greater influence over what it deems to be misinformation. You know that thing that your COVID-denying cousin has been claiming they do all the time with, like, evidence against Hunter Biden? Well, they actually kind of can do it now. Which might be okay in instances of, say, a global pandemic, but not so much when the government is complicit in aiding and abetting a fucking genocide in Palestine. And these powers can be very destructive in the wrong hands, whether those be the hands of a warmed-over Zionist corpse whose brain runs on Windows 98, or a tantruming, overgrown orange toddler with a cult of personality. And it's not just presidents who can do whatever the fuck they want. The Supreme Court also overturned the long-standing Chevron v. Natural Resources Defense Council ruling, which defers to specialized government agencies to interpret corporate regulations where there might be some ambiguity. So in the case of the 1984 Chevron case, Chevron, a big fossil fuel energy company, was running afoul of the Clean Air Act of 1963, but they challenged on the nebulous definition of a stationary source of air pollution, which would have necessitated a rigid approval process in order for said source to be constructed. But the courts ruled in favor of the NRDC, thus limiting a major corporation's ability to pump all kinds of nastiness into our good breathing air. But now, instead of deferring to agencies with experts who might be more knowledgeable about the reasoning and the ins and outs of a particular regulation, a judge can just decide for themselves how to rule in cases of legal ambiguity between corporations and the government. Meaning if, let's say, a corporation leaves a very nice present at the door of a judge, maybe the judge becomes inclined to rule in their favor when it comes to how strictly they want to enforce EPA regulations or NLRB regulations. Many of our Supreme Court justices get lots of lovely presents, it just so happens. You know, pretty soon, Boeing won't have to knock off whistleblowers. They'll just be allowed to shrug and say, well, the judge ruled that it's okay to have doors fly off of our passenger planes so long as we don't exceed 5 occurrences within a fiscal year. Meanwhile, the US can continue to pour taxpayer money into this extremely unpopular Israeli conflict without our consent and despite our objections. Greg Abbott can openly defy presidential orders so that he can keep killing people and turn his nose up to efforts to make what he's doing legal. Jennifer Gross, Bill Dean, Melanie Miller, and Beth Lear can just disregard the wishes of their constituents and make up whatever rules they want. Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema can personally enrich themselves with ties to the fossil fuel industry. Donald Trump can incite a coup against the federal government, can cheat in his real estate dealings, can maliciously keep classified documents, can deliberately choose illegal campaign finance options, can publicly defame a woman accusing him of rape, can disregard a judge-issued gag order, but it's somehow up in the air whether or not anything seriously bad will happen to him. They're all fine. There's no guarantee what, if anything, will happen to these guys. They just get to keep being in charge and living large. One of them might even get to be president again someday, regardless of whether or not he goes to jail, and then he can just pardon himself. Though, let's be real, he will not ever go to prison. But I bet you if you tried to go out of state for an abortion or got caught smoking weed, even though those are totally victimless crimes, they'd get your ass sent to the slammer in no fucking time whatsoever. And none of it is shocking to anyone. What are you gonna do about it? They're in charge. They have every legal right to do whatever they want. They don't have to do what you want just because you voted for it. The law is on their side in most instances. And when it's not, they can just cheat. They can just change the rules. They can just break them. Whatever. Who cares? What are you gonna do? And isn't that interesting? How we all know our justice system is for sale, that your innocence can be bought. How we all know our politicians are all crooks, that voting for them doesn't guarantee any kind of policy change, that their policy can similarly be bought and sold, that if you're big enough, nobody can or will do hardly anything to stop you, while if you're small enough, they'll do whatever it takes to stop you, and yet, we somehow still believe that we live in a democracy. They could fix all the things we want them to fix whenever they want to, and even if they pretend that they do want to, their actions sure don't seem to match it. Well, we'll just vote them out if they don't. Yeah? Who are you gonna vote for? Genocide Joe? Kamala Cop? Hitler quoting Trump? The giant douche or the turd sandwich? Ohio voted overwhelmingly for marijuana and abortion rights. Where are they at, gang? And if they can just lie in their election campaigns, how do you know you're gonna get what you want? How can you make an informed opinion if they'll just bullshit you? And if it turns out they were liars, how many years do you have to wait to get a chance to maybe get the right guy in? After all, Trump didn't win the popular vote, but he still won the presidency. And even with all the crazy fucking schemes he got up to, they couldn't even vote to impeach him after multiple impeachment attempts. How many years of suffering under unfair shit you don't want, unjust political violence you know that you rightfully shouldn't have to, are you going to endure in order to play by the rules and maybe fix things within the system? How old are you going to be when you finally vote for the person who actually fixes something like they promised? And how many other things will have fallen apart in the intermediary time? Because, just a reminder, this stuff has a material impact on your everyday life. Yeah, it turns out I had a good reason to pair last episode with this one, huh? If I'm not careful, people are going to start thinking I actually know what I'm doing with these videos. Standing up to these people, calling them out, criticizing them, fighting them, is all self-defense. A shitty immigration policy is putting more children in cages, is allowing them or their families to be shot by Border Patrol agents, or torn up by underwater barbed wire, or left to rot in detention beds until the right paperwork is filled out, all because they might be seeking asylum and wanting better lives. So pushing back on that policy is defending the needy. Shitty marijuana policy is arresting otherwise probably pretty chill people for a non-violent crime, is fining them, is hurting their ability to find legal employment, is imprisoning them with mandatory minimum sentencing, subjecting them to prison labor and prison violence, is wasting so much taxpayer money to fund the police and prisons and the justice system that fight marijuana use, all because people want to relax and enjoy some mood-enhancing, possibly medicinal brain chemicals. So pushing back on that policy is protecting freedom. Shitty abortion policy is imprisoning people for not wanting to carry their rapist child, for maybe not being able to financially care for a child, for maybe not being mentally and emotionally capable of caring for a child, is punishing people for daring to want to have sex just for pleasure, is threatening doctors who might be performing life-saving medicine, is allowing the state to determine what you do with your own body, is allowing the state to alter the course of your life and a potential child's life. So pushing back on that policy is saving lives. And if your big plan to save lives, to defend the weak, to protect freedom begins and ends with the ballot box, with political crapshoots, then what the fuck are you actually doing? Imagine if that was Superman's response to Lex Luthor's crazy villain scheme. Up, up, and away! I have a petition to mail to my senator. I have to donate to Bernie Sanders' re-election campaign. I have to do some phone banking for issue 6 so that our schools can get adequate public funding. And hey, that's cool and rad and all, Superman, but the kryptonite ray has already been built, and Luthor's already firing it. And I'm pretty sure he already knows he's not supposed to build a kryptonite ray, but he did it anyways because he doesn't care. I'd love to prevent future supervillainy, but we have supervillainy already in progress that needs to be addressed now. Well, we can protest! Nonviolent protesting and civil disobedience are great ways to get your voices heard in ways that aren't as easy to ignore. I mean, I'll grant you, I don't hate that idea. You and 10,000 other people making yourselves super annoying to someone trying to do something awful is definitely a good show of force. It makes it hard for other people to ignore these terrible actions, both those whom you're opposing and those who can be made into allies for your cause. I mean, look at Martin Luther King Jr. He was a big advocate for nonviolent protest, and he's remembered as a hero by the same country that wanted to kill him. Wait, what? Yes, MLK Jr., the same guy who has a federal holiday named after him, not Malcolm X, not Fred Hampton, not Huey P. Newton, not Roy Wilkins, Martin Luther King was once sent a blackmail package from the FBI that contained supposed audio evidence of Dr. King's sexual indiscretions which his wife Coretta Scott dismissed as, quote, mumbo-jumbo. And the package vaguely advocated that King commit suicide to prevent these indiscretions being made public. Both the CIA and the FBI were illegally surveilling King, as they were many civil rights leaders, such as some of the ones I listed. After the assassination of JFK in 1963, Dr. King told his wife that the same fate awaited him. King was obviously assassinated in 1968, supposedly by James Earl Ray, but the suspicious nature of Ray's testimony in his trial, coupled with the fact that the CIA and FBI were known to have been very much opposed to Dr. King, have led people to believe that Ray may have been part of a conspiracy or was set up as a fall guy rather than having been a crazed lone agent. And in fact, 1979 saw the United States House Select Committee on Assassinations conclude the likelihood of such a conspiracy having taken place. Further, in 1993, Lloyd Jowers, who was said to have been in the restaurant nearby the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was staying at the time of his assassination, came forward alleging that he, in conjunction with the Mafia and the United States government, were actually responsible for Dr. King's murder. In 1999, the Lloyd Jowers trial in Memphis saw the jury conclude that indeed, there was a conspiracy to murder Dr. King. But the following year saw U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno conclude, after thorough investigation, that no conspiracy occurred. Well, I suppose that if the U.S. government says it didn't do some shady shit that it's accused of, surely that means they didn't do it. What with King by this point a national treasure and a martyr for now accepted norms, I'm sure that means we can simply take them at their word. And again, Dr. King was a strong advocate of marches, of prayers, sit-ins, public speeches, public demonstrations, and overall, non-violence. The Black Panthers were militant. Malcolm X believed fiercely in black nationalism and segregation. These were the far more radical and potentially dangerous members of the civil rights movement. But Dr. King believed that maybe appeals to morality would be sufficient. That's what made him so popular, that he didn't want people to get hurt. It made him a more appealing choice to progressives who were maybe a little uncomfortable by the rhetoric of some of his more extreme contemporaries. It made him the most celebrated and influential figure of the civil rights movement. And for it, they killed him. Or at the very least, if you don't believe the conspiracy, they at least wanted him dead. For proposing reform over violence, they wanted him dead. And Dr. King was a huge public figure. The eyes of the world were on him. The rest of us, we're nobodies. If we disappeared into a panel van the next day, who would notice? Our 140 Insta followers? Get real. Well, okay, but that was then. This is now. Don't be stupid. 1968 wasn't even 60 years ago. How many of the men and women in Congress today were already involved in politics at that time? And what do we have as a civil rights crisis beyond racial segregation? Well, look at the genocide in Palestine. Look at how extremely unpopular it is among both Democrat and Republican-leaning citizens. We didn't vote to contribute to this conflict, and we're making it clear that we don't like it that we're contributing to this conflict. The First Amendment guarantees the rights to free speech and to peaceably assemble. And yet, several of our congressmen are citing the pro-Palestinian sentiments as one of the reasons they want to ban TikTok. Mitt Romney, Josh Hawley, and Mike Lawler have all explicitly stated that this anti-Israel sentiment is a contributing factor in Congress's strong consideration to ban the platform in the US. We can't get enough people on board to fix our crumbling infrastructure without massive concessions, but there's overwhelming bipartisan support for shutting up the noisy peasants and their silly meme dances. Hillary Clinton keeps insisting on reminding everyone that she exists and that she's fucking terrible by stating that people are uneducated about the situation, as if you need to be educated to think that 30,000 and counting needless civilian deaths is a bad thing. Hey Hillary, maybe the stupid bitch who couldn't even beat Donald Trump in an election and who is still married to Jeffrey Epstein's best friend should just shut the fuck up forever, huh? Maybe you just take the hint and fuck off, huh? Hillary? Huh? They're somehow always anti-war for every war in history except for the current war. And they're somehow always pro-civil rights for every civil rights movement in history except for the current movement. They hate your speech about disliking genocide, and they hate that you're emboldened by that speech, hate that it's causing you to distrust and hate them, the ruling authority, so they want to discourage you from saying anything. Bill H.R. 6090, aka the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, that was recently passed in the House and is on its way to the Senate, could be legally interpreted as forbidding the criticism of Israel or comparing the Palestinian apartheid state to Nazi Germany. So they can just change the rules whenever they like to make how you express your discontent illegal if they feel strongly enough about it. And it hardly seems a coincidence that some of our southern states are trying to restrict your right to peacefully protest by holding the organizers of said protest legally accountable for any illegal actions perpetrated by anyone present at the protest. So you could be holding a perfectly reasonable, well-intentioned, law-abiding protest, but if one person gets a little too rowdy and spray paints a building, or gets into a dust-up with the cops, or perhaps there's someone who doesn't like your protest who joins it and then starts deliberately acting up, then even if you just intended to chant and hold up signs, suddenly you're eating litigious shit. And faced with that, maybe you lose your nerve to speak out. Kind of wild how one protester can invalidate an entire protest, but several dozen openly corrupt politicians using the system how they please doesn't invalidate the system. But it was just a couple states, DBiddles, and the Supreme Court might still overturn those decisions in Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi. And surely the public will side with the cause of righteousness when they see principled people speaking out in a principled fashion. You know, I admire that worldview, friend. Some might call it naivete, but I recognize the belief in the goodness of your fellow man when I see it. Thing is, though, they don't. The BLM protests of 2020 were overwhelmingly peaceful and lawful, but that did not stop much of the media as characterizing them as unruly, chaotic, and destructive. Because again, despite being overwhelmingly peaceful, false claims of violence and riots were everywhere, of major metropolitan areas supposedly burning to the ground where the protests were largest, of small, black-owned businesses being victimized, vandalized, and looted. Because somehow we have come to value property over people. That's how you know the riots were actually more peaceful than the news would have you believe. If people had been hurt by the rioters, if there was footage of that, we'd never have heard the end of it. If things were really that chaotic, surely more people would have gotten hurt. But all the media can focus on is a few broken windows and looted stores, because they too believe that stuff is more important than people. Most of the footage shows the cops being the instigators of much of the aggression, of them running over unarmed people with their cruisers, of tear gassing people as they marched and sang. That's right, the most injury done wasn't by the people who were mad at the police for applying unnecessary lethal force to a non-violent offender. The most injury done was by the people who were mad at the people who were mad at the police for extrajudiciously killing a man. For all of MLK's efforts, for all the reforms won through protests, marches, and legislation, we still live in a deeply flawed, deeply discriminatory system. Even Barack Obama went on record as saying that the protesters were being unreasonable in calling for the defunding of the police. How many times did you hear the phrase, "I respect their right to protest lawfully, but they're just taking it too far"? How? What would have been an appropriate form of protest? Doing it in such a way that no one is inconvenienced or made to pay attention to the issue that they want to draw attention to? You don't get to choose a more convenient way for people to bitch you out when you won't address their legitimate grievances. You can see this even now with the campus protests, where a bunch of college kids all across the country are merely sitting in tents on the lawn and are facing down abuse from cops who are just so mad at these dumb kids laying around and not going to class. You skip class and stay in bed scrolling Pinterest until your hands go numb from holding up the phone, nobody cares. But the second you're doing it for a cause, doing it in a way that can't be ignored and makes those in charge look bad, suddenly you're a dangerous subversive who needs to be put down with force. And isn't it weird how the cops always flock to put down non-violent, principled protests with the most force rather than Klan gatherings or Unite the Right rallies or neo-Nazi truckers? They're always lead-footed when the crowd is chanting "Hang Mike Pence," always cowardly when there's a single gunman terrorizing elementary school students. But they have endless enthusiasm and courage for firing less lethal ammunition at unarmed students advocating anti-war causes. The government doesn't send the National Guard to beat up Klansmen or COVID deniers or pro-lifers when they protest, not until they get really, really, really rowdy, because those interests don't interfere with the government's wishes. But they barely need an excuse to mobilize against students shouting at federal officials for being war-hungry profiteers of genocide. Look at the Kent State Massacre of 1970 over Vietnam. Liberalism loves civility. Liberalism loves when everyone's polite, because civility and quiet, polite discourse enables it to continue in its decidedly uncivil and impolite policy. They're free to ignore you when you're just standing off to the side merely tut-tutting every evil thing they want to continue doing. But liberalism hates when people actually do something. America mythologizes its own revolutionary origins. The Boston Tea Party, the Declaration of Independence, the war for the colonies' right to govern themselves, the injustice of taxation without representation, of representative democracy fighting for liberation from monarchical rule. But when they're the monarchy, when they're in charge, Suddenly, a bunch of outspoken 20-somethings with lattes and live streams are the equivalent of musket-wielding guerrilla forces opposing the rightful rule of the homeland. There is no acceptable form of protest that is also effective in disrupting what it means to speak out against. I've said this before, if appeals to morality were enough to correct injustice, those injustices would not have been allowed to flourish long enough for us to seek out more extreme alternatives. And it's not an accident that it works this way. The intended function of any system is what it does. These people keep doing awful shit to the world, and yet you think you can just suddenly convince them to be nice when they are able to disregard or abuse you however they please without consequence. Kings and tyrants will not willingly weaken themselves, will not willingly concede power, will not willingly relinquish some of their absolute control. They must be forced to. What is legal is not always righteous. What is righteous is not always legal. Liberalism will rely on legality to dissuade righteousness, because if they don't like righteous action, they can legally use force to make you comply. After all, at that point, then you are the asshole for not following the rules. If all we have is the honor system to ensure that our democracy functions, to ensure that legalism aligns with righteousness, if all we have is pinky promises, then democracy is already dead. That's it. That's all there is to it. The few govern the many instead of vice versa. And trying to find middle ground always ends up in us ceding some precedent to evil. And again, to call back to last episode, real harm is done with this. Real, material violence. And while I don't relish real-world violence, I don't relish when people get shot or beaten or blown up outside of the realms of superheroes, monsters, robots, ninjas, etc., I do understand the need for self-defense. I do understand that sometimes circumstances are kill or be killed. I do understand that being complacent can often mean being complicit. If you watched my Gurren Lagann video, watch my Gurren Lagann video, then you know that I believe in progress being inevitable. But I'm not so starry-eyed as to believe that it happens on its own. It must be made to happen through constant, stubborn, dug-in refusal to accept things as they are. That's why it's important to complain about things. Squeaky wheels get oil. And like I said in that video, it was easier to accomplish some serious wheel squeaking in days gone past when both soldier and civilian had rifles and sabers. When horses were not just standard conveyance, but standard infantry. When bronze or longbow or gunpowder was the peak of warfare. But we live in an age of radars, infrared and wiretaps, of attack helicopters, of reactive armor, of remote-controlled drones, of tear gas and weaponized biological agents, of tactical nukes, a surveillance state of atomized, isolated individuals in densely packed communities. How do you fight back in that environment? You can't just buy a fucking Sherman tank at Walmart like you can a hunting rifle, and hunting rifles have pretty long odds against tanks. And even then, could you even muster up the guts to fight? I understand, it's terrifying. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Okay, well I don't have much, but what I have is precious, and it could all be taken away so easily. And as far as I know, this is the only life I have. Martyrs do not get to enjoy the fruits of future victory. I can't blame anyone for being scared. I am too. So what can we do? Well, viewer, I don't know what you expect me to say in this video about Code Geass, a series wherein the plot involves the failures of liberalism and the heroes deciding to bloodily murder their oppressors. But I swear, with my left hand on the Bible and my right hand raised, that I would never advocate for you to break the law. No, sir, Your Honor, heaven forbid. In fact, I wouldn't dare suggest anything that would go against the federal government of this or any nation. But, speaking purely hypothetically, if I were to think that maybe a militia of upstart civilians starting a proletarian revolution against our beloved oligarchs was a good idea, I suppose I would have a couple things I could suggest, since you're twisting my arm and all. Number 1. Own a gun. Now, I don't like violence, nor do I think it's an ideal solution, but it's sometimes regrettably necessary. Owning guns is still legal, though strictly regulated, and in many states, carrying or concealed carrying is legal. And while I understand how gun violence is terrifying and that so much preventable death occurs in the presence of firearms, it's hard to deny that having a gun handy, even if you don't intend to use it, is a great way to dissuade people from messing with you. Ronald Reagan was actually motivated to institute some of our country's most strict gun regulations in response to marginalized groups like the black community taking up arms during a time of great racial tension. They know that people are harder to oppress with guns. So even if you don't want to be like those LARPing cowboy militia member wannabes who lustfully grip their assault rifles hoping that some inner-city minority will give them an excuse to perform a legal kill, having a few people who march alongside progressive activists with guns strapped to them is a good way to keep cops and counter-protesters from fucking with you. Again, cops always seem to lose their nerve around those who are similarly armed, even if they do have riot shields and body armor and an entire precinct of backup. Quick disclaimer, if you suffer from severe mental and emotional illness, maybe skip this step. Not because statistically you're likely to be a danger to others, but because statistically you're likely to be a danger to yourself. So please be safe. Number 2, self-sustainability. Grow your own food, generate your own power, learn to repair your own stuff, learn first aid, and then offer these skills to people in your community. The more you can avoid being reliant on big corporations or public utilities for your daily necessities, the less you are beholden to them. I know that between this and the guns, it sounds like I'm advocating for doomsday prepping, but no, I'm not saying you should build a bunker and stockpile beans and ammo. Be part of a community. There is strength in solidarity. This will definitely get a video of its own at some point, but being able to provide for yourself and your friends and neighbors and not having to individually go out and buy your own provisions for your own solitary self from some big, powerful, amorphous group is a great way to get out from under someone else's thumb. And those practical skills can be used in a multitude of scenarios. It's the old Boy Scout motto, be prepared. Knowing how to field dress a wound or grow and harvest your own vegetables, and sharing this with average folks whom you know endears them to you and strengthens community ties. And that leads to number 3, solidarity. We are stronger together. Apes together, strong. Knowing people in your community, having relationships with them, even if they're fairly casual, makes it easier for us to stand together. If a stranger is being harassed by local toughs or is in need of help on the side of the road, it's really easy to mind your own business. Convince yourself it's not your problem. Hell, you don't even know the full story. Maybe it's good that whatever is happening to them is happening to them. But if that's Nathan the mailman who always has some cheerful conversation when you bump into him dropping off your eBay packages, well shit man, I like Nathan. I want to help Nathan out if he's in a jam. That's Susie from down the street who has all the cool Halloween decorations and who came over and complimented you on your Halloween decorations. Why is Susie protesting? It might actually be important. I better find out. Oh hey, I know you. You're Chloe. Hey, I work with your mom. She talks about you all the time. Why are you running? What are those sirens? Do you need help? Come inside, quick. Hey, don't you own the local candy shop? The one with the Wizard of Oz theme? My kid loves that place. What's this petition? Tell me about your issues. I want to do my part. Number 4, mutual aid. This is just the next step to solidarity. If you can give a few extra bucks, even if it's not much, enough people pitching in can fund some really cool shit. Or you can help someone out of a pinch with a little investment in their future. Hey, this is where those self-sustainability skills will come in handy. You can just help somebody out without giving them money. We can't rely on our institutions to take care of us, even though that's what they should be for. So it's up to us to crowdfund each other, to help each other out. You give what you can when you can, because you don't know when you might need a helping hand. None of us are as strong as all of us. No one person is able to provide as much as a bunch of people working together. And generosity goes a long way. Every now and again, someone's gonna fall on tough times. Everyone's going to need the help of a passing stranger, a good Samaritan, when the world is suddenly bearing down on you. The systems that we designed aren't doing what they're supposed to, so it's up to us. Number 5, organizing. Get in touch with like-minded individuals so that together you can come up with and enact bigger, more effective means of pushing back. One person shouting about a problem? That's a nuisance. A bunch of people shouting about it? That's a mob. A bunch of people shouting while using tactics and techniques that they thought up beforehand to get in the way of anyone who might try to shut them down? Now that's a force to be reckoned with. One person shouting won't always think to video record incidents on their phone when things get heated, hypothetically. One person shouting about something won't think to use their bike lock to barricade a door, hypothetically. One person shouting won't think to slash the tires of police cruisers, hypothetically. One person shouting won't think to bring gas masks or tennis rackets to deal with tear gas canisters, hypothetically. But an army of well-organized folks? Now that's a phalanx, that's a squad. And short of overwhelming state force like a bomber plane, that squad can really show how citizens are not to be fucked with. I mean, let's be real, the voting thing is because we determined it was the nicest, most gracious, least violent way of enacting the will of the people. Maybe some folks need to be reminded why, if they happen to be part of the 43%, that they shouldn't be pissing off the 57%, and why that's especially true if they're actually part of a 1% minority rather than a 43% minority. Because the alternative is Marie Antoinette and Bastille Day. And they know that. That's why they build bomber planes. Because they're afraid of people rallying together. They fear that so much they need to build ever more terrifying weapons of war to dissuade anyone from standing against them. And while these weapons are powerful, they can only do so much when members of the 43 start getting outraged by the state's use of them against their fellow man and start recognizing how much they have in common with the 57. Suddenly, the precision snap of a guillotine on a few necks seems more humane than the state's stormtroopers. And those in authority don't even wield this power themselves. Presidents and politicians and businessmen don't personally fight the wars they start. They don't personally crack the skulls they oppress. They don't personally enforce the laws they enact. Hell, they don't even follow those laws themselves. They need other people to do it for them. They need other people to grind the boot heels that stamp on our necks. They don't have the stones or the stomach for it. They need to delegate that. They're cowards. They constantly need to be reinforcing this narrative that they're in control, while setting up the people who protect them as noble enforcers of law and order, and trying to convince those guard dogs that they have a duty to protect them as leaders rather than their fellow citizens. They need people to think that they're worth defending so that people keep defending them, so that the public keep tearing each other down in the name of propping them up. They need people to think that they're kings and queens and divinely appointed monarchs, and that the public have a duty as peasants to protect them. Because supposedly the kings are supposed to serve their kingdoms, their nations, and that a threat to them is a threat to our well-being. But they clearly don't serve the public trust. They clearly do not give a shit about the public's well-being. They clearly regard the public with contempt if the public don't unquestioningly obey them. And they need to be cautious in how much force they use to keep the public down. Because if they go too ham, if they get too disproportionate, if they use too much force all at once, their supposed peacekeepers stop looking so peaceful. Their soldiers may come to look at their own hands as they enact brutal suppression tactics on all of us, and realize that they are not, in fact, keeping the peace or serving the public interest. And when that happens, the facade of civility they rely on is torn off. So, if hypothetically they are forced into going too hard, they know they'll only have an even bigger problem on their hands. Now remember, I'm still speaking purely hypothetically, but if I had a sixth suggestion, it would be obstruction and sabotage. The machine that grinds people down is huge and overwhelming, but that also means that there's 100 little ways one can jam up the gears, hypothetically speaking, through extra legal methods. I don't know, I myself couldn't come up with any specific examples of this, what with me being a civic-minded, law-abiding citizen, but I imagine deliberate acts of property damage would be most frustrating to powers that seek to oppress. After all, when profit and property are more valuable to someone than human well-being, well, hypothetically, fucking up their shit without actually hurting anyone would really ruin their day. Conceivably, asymmetrical power dynamics could, hypothetically, be disrupted and overwhelmed with surprise hit-and-run strikes, rather than just meeting them head-on. It's how America lost the Vietnam War. Frustrate if you can't overpower. The myth that one can't fight City Hall, that the House always wins, presumes one will play by the rules of those establishments. But since the rules are always fluid in one side's favor, it's likely not worth following those rules. Hypothetically. There's a difference between terrorists and freedom fighters, and the difference is how justified you think the person doing those acts is in acting out. Of course, since our leaders view anything that contradicts them as out of line, as disturbing their beloved civility, they're going to be pretty casual in employing the term terrorism. Many of them are already using that term to describe the college students who are, I remind you, camping out on campus grounds, singing, chanting, and holding up signs. Just like they regarded Dr. King, who was not a soldier, who was not a militant, but who was a preacher, an activist, a speaker, a scholar, they regarded him as a terrorist, a threat to national security. But that doesn't mean there's no room for violence, hypothetically. The American Revolutionary War was not peaceful. The fight against Nazi Germany was not peaceful. Freedom fighters are called that because they fight, often quite hard, often quite brutally, for the freedom that they crave. Force would, in such circumstances, be hypothetically necessary because those who oppress will not willingly relinquish the mechanism of their oppression. And what justifies that effort is the appropriate use and appropriate targeting of that force. Terrorism is random. It doesn't care whom it hurts or why. With terrorism, civilians are just casualties because the point is instilling terror. In freedom fighting, civilians are the people they want to liberate, and their enemies are those who actively participate in eliminating that freedom. So one would, hypothetically, need to be judicious in their use of force, always aiming for the serpent's head, and then burning the next stump so that 2 more hydras do not spring from it. To simply start blowing up buildings or firing wildly would make one look like a maniac. Hypothetically. After all, electoralism, democracy, liberalism is supposed to be the polite and safe way we enact policy in accordance with the will of the governed. It's the way we do things so that nobody has to get hurt. But it only works if it, works. If it doesn't, then perhaps it would, in those circumstances, be prudent to remind those who are put in charge how and why things are supposed to work as they should. Minoritarians need all those big guns, all those armored vehicles and heat-seeking missiles and tactical drones, because they know that enough of us working together can overpower them. They know it, and they need to rely on making people afraid of them in order to protect themselves. They try to appeal to a sense of morality in dissuading people because they know that those folks likely actually have a sense of morals. Meanwhile, they, having almost unrestricted power and authority, never bother to fret over the morality of their actions. Justice can seem evil when described by an evil force. 2 wrongs do not make a right, but ignoring a wrong done is itself doing another wrong. The first wrong will simply continue unabated. The second wrong should only exist to halt the first and should cease when the other ceases. The first wrong will continue to expand if permitted, will be emboldened to increase in its audacity. They know this as well. That's why they employ similarly forceful, coercive tactics to halt the public. They'll double down on their own wrongs to continue them. Just authority can only be derived from the consent of the governed. But if the powers that be are coercing people into recognizing that authority, if they are abusing that authority, if there are basically no legitimate avenues to challenge that authority, it cannot be considered just. They'll do whatever they damn well please, and if the people get mad, they'll just tell the public to vote harder. Their democracy, as it exists, is a means by which they can give the public the illusion of power over the system, but they'll just dance to that tune up until it stops being convenient for them, and then they'll just tell the public to eat shit. They need people to not recognize the strength they have when they work together and express their collective discontent. They pass their laws and flex their draconian authority because they know that their bite isn't as powerful as the people's bite, so they're hoping they can trick people into looking away. And when that doesn't work, they'll try to make the public feel like they're the assholes for pushing back. And when that doesn't work, they'll simply demonstrate how little they give a shit about democracy. I again don't know how things will play out in the future or what the best strategies are or will end up being. I'm just a guy, and not a particularly bright one at that. I said this kit was called the Lancelot Albion, didn't I? Again, my knowledge of Arthurian legend is pretty shaky, but I do know that Arthur quite famously died in the legend. Arthur and Lancelot do battle over the fate of Guinevere. Whilst distracted, Arthur's incestuous bastard son Mordred claims the throne of Camelot. Arthur and Lancelot set their differences aside, and Arthur and Mordred mortally wound each other in epic battle. And with Mordred dead, Morgan Le Fay, who is Mordred's mother and Arthur's half-sister, and Nimue, the Lady of the Lake, who gifted Arthur Excalibur, come to carry the dying Arthur to Avalon, the mystical land off the shores of Albion. And it's believed that there he is revived, leaving only his helmet in the tomb. With Arthur gone, the beautiful and powerful kingdom of Camelot fades into history, but it's believed that Arthur may yet return and restore Camelot someday. Whilst Arthur and his knights are portrayed heroically, it's pretty clear they're actually far from perfect. You know, what with the secret affairs and bloody battles between supposedly honorable knights and the incestuous bastards who bring ruin to the land. For all the talk and all the various accounts, Camelot was actually not peaceful, and for all the hope, it or its like has never returned. Kings seem so big and powerful and wise and good in their time, but with the benefit of hindsight, we can see just how fallible and foolish and temporary they were. Albion is the ancient name of the British Isles. As the legends go, it was named this by the original inhabitants who were said to be giants. But the exiled Brutus of Troy led his people to conquer Albion and slay what few giants remained, renaming the island to Britain after himself. So when the British reference Albion, it's a callback to the myth of their people as giant slayers. But outside of fairy tales, Britain itself became quite the giant too. If you recall my previous episode, 65 nations across the world are former British colonies that now celebrate their independence from Britain. Seemingly small, upstart nations that threw off the overwhelming power of a former global superpower, of a powerful and imposing monarchy, of kings who felt entitled to do what they please, damn the consequences, and subjugate those under their thumb with an iron fist. The violence of enforcing their control is never viewed as poorly as the violence of resisting that control, because the winners write the history books. And since eventually those revolutionaries did win, it is only then that the justice of their causes is accepted, but those struggles were just the entire time. America, where I live, was one such nation that won its independence and right to self-govern with the American Revolutionary War. A Declaration of Independence was not sufficient to earn this. A Boston Tea Party was not sufficient to earn this. Diplomacy and civil disobedience did not win us our independence. Bloody battle and righteous fury did. It was the actions of upstarts and rebels, of troublemakers and complainers, of militias and outlaws and anti-authoritarians, of people who were not going to take it anymore. King George III believed himself entitled to do what he pleased, to rule over the colonies with impunity, to heed not representative democracy, to take what he wanted and punish any dissent. He was a giant among men. Why shouldn't he? Who could stand against him? Who can hope to slay a giant? Who indeed? Hey! Thanks for sitting through another one, bot buds! I know these are touchy subjects and my videos are long and boring, and in this one I posed a bunch of hypotheticals of things I don't advocate for, but I appreciate you hearing me out. And if you liked this video, I'd be mighty appreciative of you rocket punching that like button. And if you liked it enough to want to check out more of my work, you can aim your beam rifle at the subscribe button. And if you think there's anything you missed or you have some criticisms, you can transform and roll out in the comments. Or if you think someone else will enjoy this mess, you can share it, and we can combine a bunch of viewers into a super robot of a viewer base. And if you think I need a few more expensive toys for my channel, I have a Ko-fi link in the description which you can throw your loose change into. I promise the next robot will be from some other show other than Code Geass. Maybe like this one? How's this one look? Pretty cool, right? I'm excited. Anyways, Chatbot's mission complete. This is DBiddles, signing off. Sayonara, bye-bye.